And certainly a very important people skill is communication. But sometimes the communication between those different departments, DevSec and Ops, that can break down. Sometimes it's because of a language barrier too, a business language barrier, as you said. So let's start there and talk about that.
Yeah, I don't know if you've ever witnessed the development of software and the day-to-day that goes into it. In particular, you bring a lot of different teams together nowadays with things like Agile and Scrum, and you might have the Scrum of Scrums where you're actually bringing business leaders into the mix. And so as you watch those conversations take place, you can see very clearly that people have their own language context of the role that they serve in those different forums. So you could watch and listen to a developer talk to a security professional, and quite often they're talking past each other. A security professional brings the notion of things like cross-site scripting, XXE, all these different attacks to the forum. A developer brings the notion of performance, scalability, how they actually write the software. Well, is that a constant that I need to change? Do I need to put telemetry in? How do I actually write my logs? What are the standards and requirements? And so those conversations get quite muddled quickly on a day-to-day basis. And that context alone for people can be quite challenging. It can create friction and distrust. And that's actually something that undoes the ultimate goal, which is to have software safer sooner. And I think that the development context is something that needs a partner, if you will, in both ops and security that are fashioned around the experience and the expertise that brings it back to that developer, but solves for making it accessible so that they're not trying to take away every ounce of time that a developer has to do their job.
Yeah, well, it's like you mentioned cross-site scripting, right? And you mentioned that as an example, and what that could really come down to is bad input validation, and then the developer might just be like, well, why didn't you just say that in the first place? Was the example that you had previously given me.
Yeah, and I think that's an important piece of the puzzle is the language itself that gets mixed up is something where we were talking about the accessibility. I think it is important for us to have a map. It's not just input validation, but think about it from the standpoint of all the different attack types, the vulnerabilities. You could be talking about a system misconfiguration, just leveling it up, bringing that security context to a level that a developer can understand and appreciate that makes it actionable will transform it for them. And I think the other is true too, is when a developer is talking to a security professional, they should be bringing that notion of, well, is it an input validation issue? Is it a system misconfiguration issue? What kind of issue is it? And then can you help me to be able to test those things so that they can be more traditionally viable in terms of where the software is going? I think that ultimately developers have the ability to get a better feedback loop, but they also have to be part of that translation. And I think it's true on the other direction as well. So, people is probably the biggest needle mover in terms of trying to fix a feedback loop. And I'm glad we started with it because that's the one that I think if we had to do anything, people talk about it as being a culture problem in DevOps and Agile. I'm not sure it's just a culture problem. I think that culture can be language as part of it, but that's also tone and how you bring yourself to work every day and whether you trust somebody and how you trust them. And I think that just fixing language could easily make it so you understand the reliability of the other roles and you can put some understanding and context together so that there isn't as much friction. And therefore, culture won't become as big of a deal as it has been traditionally.
Yeah, it's a great point that there is a lot that can be done in this people and communication area. And one of the other things that falls under as a subset of communication, I think, is setting goals and really being able to properly communicate them. And you mentioned that this was actually really an important step to take too in that people area. So explain a little bit.
Yeah, I've been wildly provoked by OKRs, which are objectives and key results. It's something that my organization has been investing in, and we call them goals. And as part of this endeavor, what I've found is that most of the time people aren't really great at goals. And the reason they're not necessarily great at goals is that they aren't really looking at the metrics associated with how they're going to put a goal together. I've seen that once you start to create those metrics associated with something, you can easily get a person to be able to understand how they're going to move the metric and create a goal that might have to have some level of work associated with it they can break down to get that needle to move that's in the metric that's been established. But I don't commonly see it as a forefront or a thing that actually helps the feedback loop in many companies. And I think it has to actually get established so that that does become true. Because if you can imagine, how do you solve software safer sooner? You have to have some way of talking about it that makes it so it does become accessible. And I think that a lot of times we can get to a point where words are complicated, but numbers are less complicated. Now, I won't say that numbers are going to solve all things, because as we know, numbers can also lie. But I think if you're actually trying to measure and you're trying to use the language of measurement to try and figure out what you want to achieve in a company, that it does actually help all of these different facets of the people problem.
All right, let's do one more people problem. And
Okay.
this one kind of straddles the line a little bit, I think, between people and process. So it's a good one to then transition us into process. And it's that you've noted that developers tend to be really curious about who their customers are, but not nearly showing the level of interest they should be in studying their potential adversaries and who's going to be most interested in attacking them. So explain a little bit more about that and why that's an issue and what can be done about it.
Yeah, through some of the research I've done over the years, one of the interesting parts of this challenge came to light to me when I was sitting down with a few developers working on a project, doing some embedded research, and they were talking about the customers, and they were talking about how they solve use cases. And it occurred to me that they were talking about how do they get to the point where they've got 80% of the customers through a use case. And that was interesting and unique, because I'm like, well, okay, but how are we thinking about adversaries in that mix? And the thing that was said was that adversaries are edge cases or abuse cases. And those get less attention in many cases in most software development processes that I've seen. So when asked, and this is an interesting tip that I think most security professionals and developers should have in their bag of tricks, if you will, is to ask, how many adversaries does my application have? Because ultimately that's going to drive how much investment you need to be able to protect that software. It's going to drive how much you pay attention to the software, and it's going to actually make it much easier to have conversations as the people part of this between the different constituents, because now it's easy to talk about, this is the customer segment, this is the adversary segment. Here is an overlap of those two segments that looks like it could be legitimate or not legitimate. And I think it's really important to get that sorted out as we're talking about software, because that helps you to understand whether you need to build in some adversary resistance or not. I mean, there are applications out there that are not that interesting for an adversary. And so, nowadays we have a lot of, I think, speculation that happens around whether something's secure or not. I like to think that we can get to a much more objective method, and that's going to make it much easier for the people part of this, because then it can be learned.